Catholic priest who is accused of molesting them over 3 decades.
For decades, the Catholic Church in Boston was more than a place of worship. It was an authority. Moral, compass, a trusted presence woven into daily life, schools, families, and neighborhoods. Parents handed over their children believing they were being placed in the safest hands imaginable. What they did not know, what they were never told, was that behind parish doors, the institution they trusted was choosing silence over truth. At the center of that silence was Father John J. Gehane. John Gehane was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1962. He appeared ordinary, even gentle. He was assigned to parishes across the Boston area, often working closely with children. Parents trusted him instinctively. He visited homes, coached youth activities, and held positions that gave him unrestricted access to minors. There were no warning signs visible to the public, and that was precisely the problem. The first known complaints against Gehane emerged in the early 1970s. Parents reported inappropriate behavior. Children described sexual abuse. These were not rumors whispered in isolation. They were formal accusations delivered directly to church leadership. What followed was not accountability. It was concealment. Rather than remove Gehane from ministry, church officials reassigned him, again, and again, and again. Over a period spanning more than 30 years, Gehane was quietly transferred between parishes, at least 6 different assignments, each time placed among new families, who had no knowledge of his past. Internal church records later revealed that high-ranking officials were fully aware of the allegations. Some diocesan files even acknowledged that Gehane posed a danger to children, yet he remained in active service. The church's priority was not protecting victims, it was protecting the institution. The abuse continued. Survivors later testified that Gehane exploited trust deliberately. He groomed children, isolated them, and used his position as a priest to silence them. Many victims did not speak out for decades, burdened by shame, fear, and the belief that no one would believe them over a priest. Some struggled with addiction, depression, and fractured relationships well into adulthood. Others never recovered. Parents who suspected wrongdoing were often reassured by church officials that matters had been handled. In reality, handling meant secrecy. No police reports, no public warnings, no removal from access to children. The silence was systematic. By the 1990s, Gehane had accumulated dozens of victims. Still, he remained protected. When civil lawsuits were filed, the archdiocese often settled quietly, using confidentiality agreements that prevented survivors from speaking publicly. Each settlement brought more silence. It was not until investigative journalism shattered the wall that the truth emerged. In 2002, reporters uncovered internal church documents showing that Cardinal Bernard Law and other senior officials had known about Ghehane's abuse for years. The records detailed patterns of complaints, psychological evaluations, and deliberate decisions to keep him in ministry despite the risk. The story ignited a global reckoning. Suddenly, survivors were no longer isolated voices. They were part of a chorus. Gehane was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child sexual assault. In 2002, he was convicted and sentenced to prison. More victims came forward after the conviction event. Over 130 survivors were linked to his abuse, making him one of the most prolific child abusers in U.S. history. But the consequences extended beyond one man. The archdiocese faced public outrage, legal collapse, and moral reckoning. Cardinal Law resigned under pressure, later reassigned quietly to a position in Rome. Another act many viewed as institutional evasion rather than accountability. The church paid hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements and was forced to release internal documents revealing how widespread the cover-up had been. In 2003, while serving his sentence, John Gehane was beaten to death in prison by another inmate. For many survivors, his death brought no closure. Justice delayed for decades had already done irreversible damage. The aftermath revealed a devastating truth. The greatest harm was not only the abuse itself, but the silence that enabled it. Had the church acted on the first reports, had it warned parents, contacted police, removed Gehane permanently, countless children would have been spared. Instead, faith was weaponized against the vulnerable. The institution that preached morality chose secrecy. The church that taught confession refused transparency, and the silence became complicity. The case of John Gehane is not just about one abusive priest. It is about a system that calculated risk, weighed reputation against children's lives, and chose to look away. It stands as one of the clearest examples of what happens when power protects itself at the expense of the innocent, and it leaves behind a haunting question that still echoes through parishes around the world. How many voices were silenced so the church could remain quiet? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Long before the Catholic Church abuse scandal reached public consciousness, there were priests whose behavior was openly troubling, quietly discussed, and deliberately ignored. Father Paul Shanley was one of them. Unlike predators who operated in secrecy, Shanley was something far more unsettling, a man whose dangerous beliefs were visible, documented, and repeatedly tolerated by church leadership. Paul Shanley was ordained as a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Boston in 1960. From early in his career, he positioned himself as a progressive voice within the church. He spoke openly about sexuality, criticized traditional doctrine, and built a reputation as someone who worked with marginalized youth. To outsiders, he appeared compassionate, unconventional, and deeply committed to helping troubled children. Inside church leadership circles, however, Shanley was known for something else entirely. As early as the 1970s, Shanley publicly advocated for relationships between adults and children, framing them as loving rather than abusive. He wrote essays, gave talks, and aligned himself with fringe organizations that promoted the normalization of sexual contact with minors. These views were not hidden, they were documented, they were known, and yet, Shanley remained a priest in good standing. Despite mounting concerns, Shanley was placed in positions that gave him direct access to vulnerable children, particularly boys with troubled home lives. He was assigned to youth ministries, residential programs, and pastoral roles where authority and trust were absolute. Parents were never warned, communities were never informed. The church did not intervene. Instead, it chose silence. Behind closed doors, internal church correspondence later revealed that officials were aware of Shanley's beliefs and allegations against him. Complaints from parents and victims accumulated over the years. Shanley was occasionally moved, sometimes reassigned to less visible roles, but never removed from ministry. Each transfer placed him among new children, new families, and new opportunities for abuse. Survivors later described a pattern of grooming that exploited emotional vulnerability. Shanley positioned himself as a protector, a mentor, a spiritual guide. He used theology to confuse boundaries and justify behavior that should have immediately raised alarms. Victims were told that what was happening was special, even holy. When some tried to speak out, they were dismissed or discouraged. The damage compounded silently. By the time the Boston Globe's investigation exposed widespread abuse in the Archdiocese in 2002, Shanley's name surfaced repeatedly. Survivors came forward, describing sexual abuse that spanned decades. Some accounts dated back to the 1960s and 70s, years when Shanley's views were already known to church officials. The question became unavoidable. How could this have continued for so long? The answer lay in institutional choice. Church leaders feared scandal more than harm. Shanley's public persona as a progressive priest complicated matters. Disciplining him risked controversy. Rather than confront the danger directly, officials opted for inaction. Silence was easier. Silence protected reputations. Silence preserved authority. But silence also protected the abuser. In 2002, Shanley was finally removed from ministry. In 2005, he was convicted on charges of rape and indecent assault of a child and sentenced to prison. He would later be convicted again for additional abuse. The courtroom testimony painted a devastating picture, not just of one man's crimes, but of decades of preventable harm. Survivors spoke of lives derailed by trauma, addiction, broken relationships, loss of faith, and lifelong psychological scars. Many testified that the deepest betrayal was not only Shanley's actions, but the church's refusal to stop him when it had the power to do so. Internal documents confirmed what survivors had long suspected. Shanley was not a rogue unknown to leadership. He was tolerated, managed, protected. The aftermath shook Boston once again. Lawsuits expanded. Faith eroded. Parishioners grappled with the realization that the church had ignored explicit warning signs not once, but repeatedly. Shanley's case became emblematic of a broader truth. Silence was not accidental. It was policy. Even after his conviction, questions lingered. How many victims never came forward? How many warnings were dismissed as inconvenient? How many careers were preserved at the cost of children's safety? Paul Shanley eventually died in custody, but the institutional failure that enabled him did not end with his sentence. His case remains a stark example of what happens when belief in authority overrides accountability, when silence becomes strategy, and it leaves behind a chilling reflection. When the danger was visible, documented, and spoken aloud, why did the church still choose not to listen? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For decades, Father Merciol Michiel de Gallardo was celebrated as one of the most powerful and influential figures in the modern Catholic Church. He was the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, a religious order praised for discipline, loyalty to Rome, and its ability to attract wealthy donors. To the Vatican, Michiel was a success story. To followers, he was a living saint. To his victims, he was something else entirely. Merciol Michiel was born in Mexico in 1920 and ordained as a priest at a young age. Charismatic, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious, he understood power early. He cultivated relationships with bishops, cardinals, and eventually popes. He presented himself as a defender of orthodoxy and a champion of the Church's future. Behind that carefully constructed image, Michiel lived a life defined by deception, manipulation, and abuse. From the earliest years of the Legionaries of Christ, Michiel targeted those under his absolute control, seminarians and young boys entrusted to him for spiritual guidance. Survivors later testified that Michiel used religious authority to isolate them, drug them, and sexually abuse them. He justified his actions using twisted theology, claiming special permissions, illnesses, or divine exemptions. Victims were told their suffering was a test from God, silence was framed as obedience, and silence was enforced. Michiel ruled the legionaries with near-total authority. Questioning him was equated with questioning God. Those who doubted him were punished, expelled, or discredited. Complaints never reached the outside world, not because they didn't exist, but because they were buried inside a system designed to protect its founder at all costs. As early as the 1950s, allegations against Michiel reached church officials. Some were detailed, some named victims, some described patterns that made coincidence impossible. Yet no decisive action followed. Instead, Michiel was briefly removed from public ministry in the late 1950s only to be quietly reinstated. No explanation was given. No warning was issued. Over the following decades, Michiel's power only grew. He expanded the legionaries internationally, opened schools and seminaries, and became a favored figure in Rome. He cultivated immense wealth through donations and political influence. His proximity to power insulated him. Accusations were dismissed as attacks on the church. Victims were labeled liars, enemies, or weak in faith. The silence was not passive. It was strategic. Survivors who tried to speak out were threatened with spiritual consequences. Some were told they would go to hell for accusing a priest. Others were pressured into recanting. Many carried their trauma alone for decades, convinced no one would believe them against a man so revered. In the 1990s, a group of former legionaries finally came forward publicly, detailing years of abuse. They presented testimony, documentation, and corroborating accounts. The response from church leadership was minimal. Investigations stalled. Michiel remained untouched. Even then, he continued to be praised publicly. It was not until the early 2000s, after broader church abuse scandals forced global scrutiny, that Michiel's case became impossible to ignore. In 2006, the Vatican finally acted. Rather than face trial, Michiel was instructed to withdraw from public ministry and live a life of prayer and penance. No charges were announced. No public acknowledgement of guilt was made. To many, it felt like another act of silence. After Michiel's death in 2008, the truth finally began to emerge in full. Investigations revealed not only widespread sexual abuse, but a double life of staggering deception. Michiel had fathered multiple children with different women, some of whom he also abused. He used church funds to support secret families. The man once hailed as a moral exemplar was exposed as a serial predator who had exploited faith, obedience, and power on an extraordinary scale. The Vatican eventually acknowledged that Michiel had lived a life devoid of scruples and that church leaders had failed gravely. The Legionaries of Christ issued apologies and restructured their leadership, but for many survivors, the acknowledgement came decades too late. The harm was irreversible. McKeel's case stands as one of the most extreme examples of institutional silence in modern religious history. This was not a local cover-up. It was global. Warnings crossed borders. Complaints reached the highest offices of the church. And still, nothing stopped him because he was useful, powerful, and protected. The lesson is devastatingly clear. When silence is chosen to preserve influence, abuse does not merely continue, it multiplies. And the question McKeel's story leaves behind is one the church still struggles to answer. How many lives were sacrificed so one man's power could remain untouched? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For years, Cardinal George Pell stood as one of the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church. He was a towering presence, physically imposing, intellectually sharp, and deeply influential. To supporters, he was a defender of doctrine and tradition. To critics and survivors, he became a symbol of something far darker. What happens when authority shields itself behind silence? George Pell was born in Australia in 1941 and rose rapidly through the church's hierarchy. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, he held senior leadership positions in Melbourne and then Sydney, eventually becoming one of the Vatican's most trusted financial administrators. His proximity to power placed him at the center of both spiritual authority and institutional control. But long before his ascent to Rome, abuse allegations were already circulating within the Australian Church. As early as the 1970s and 80s, reports emerged of clergy sexual abuse across multiple dioceses. Survivors described being assaulted as children, often after church services, choir practices, or school activities. Complaints were made, parents raised concerns, patterns were visible. What survivors encountered instead of justice was delay, denial, and silence. Pell was not accused of committing abuse during this early period. Instead, his role was institutional. As a senior church leader, he was repeatedly accused of failing to act, of knowing that abuse was occurring and choosing not to intervene decisively. Survivors and advocates later alleged that Pell prioritized the church's reputation over transparency, moving accused priests rather than reporting them to authorities. Internal records and testimonies suggested that church leadership, including Pell, was aware of repeat offenders, yet police were often not notified. Victims were discouraged from pursuing complaints. Some were offered pastoral support instead of accountability. Others were met with skepticism or outright dismissal. Silence became the response. In the 1990s, Pell publicly acknowledged that abuse had occurred within the church, but he consistently minimized institutional responsibility. He framed cases as historical failures rather than ongoing crises, emphasizing forgiveness and healing while resisting full disclosure of internal records. To survivors, these statements felt hollow words without consequences. Then came allegations that would place Pell himself at the center of global attention. In the mid-2010s, Pell was charged in Australia with sexually abusing 2 choir boys in the late 1990s. The allegations were shocking, not only because of their severity, but because of Pell's status. A cardinal, a Vatican official, one of the most powerful men in the church. In 2018, Pell was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to prison. For many survivors, the verdict represented something unprecedented, accountability reaching the highest levels. The silence that had protected authority for decades appeared to crack, but the story did not end there. In 2020, Australia's High Court unanimously overturned Pell's conviction, citing reasonable doubt. He was released after more than a year in prison. The ruling did not declare the allegations false, it ruled that the legal standard for conviction had not been met. The reaction was polarizing. Supporters declared Pell vindicated. Critics and survivors saw something else, a system once again unable to fully reckon with power. For many, the deeper issue was never just Pell's guilt or innocence. It was the culture of silence that had surrounded abuse allegations long before his own case reached court. Independent inquiries into institutional abuse in Australia painted a devastating picture. Thousands of survivors testified. The church was found to have systematically failed children, prioritizing secrecy over safety. Pell's leadership era was scrutinized not just for personal allegations, but for administrative choices that allowed abuse to persist unchecked. Even after his release, questions remained unanswered. Why were known offenders protected? Why were police excluded? Why were survivors forced to fight for recognition while institutions closed ranks? George Pell died in 2023, With his death, many survivors lost any remaining hope of full accountability. Apologies had been issued, reports had been written, but for those harmed, the damage was lifelong. His case illustrates a painful truth. Silence does not always come from ignorance. Sometimes, it comes from calculation, from the belief that authority must be preserved even if it means leaving victims unheard. When institutions choose silence, it is rarely neutral. It shapes outcomes, it delays justice, and it tells the vulnerable that their suffering is less important than reputation. The legacy of George Pell's era leaves behind a question that continues to haunt churches worldwide. When leaders know harm is happening and choose restraint over action, who is truly being protected? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For years, Theodore Edgar McCarrick stood at the very summit of Catholic power. He was a cardinal, a king, a global diplomat for the church who traveled freely, raised millions of dollars, advised popes, and shaped careers from behind closed doors. To the public, he was charming, articulate, and deeply influential. To those beneath him, he was something far more dangerous. And for decades, the church chose silence. McCarrick was ordained in 1958 and rose steadily through the ranks. By the 1980s and 1990s, he had become one of the most prominent American clerics. Serving as Archbishop of Newark and later Archbishop of Washington, D.C., his influence extended beyond parishes and dioceses. He was a trusted figure in Rome, regularly consulted on sensitive matters and international affairs. Behind that image, allegations followed him quietly for years. Seminarians, young priests, and later minors described a consistent pattern of abuse. McCarrick invited young men to his beach house, where he pressured them into sharing beds, manipulated them through spiritual authority, and retaliated against those who resisted. Survivors described an atmosphere of fear. Careers could be destroyed with a word. Silence was not just encouraged, it was enforced by power. These were not isolated rumors. As early as the 1990s, bishops and Vatican officials received reports about McCarrick's behavior. Some diocesan leaders warned others privately. Settlements were paid quietly to victims, bound by confidentiality agreements. Files were created, notes were taken. Yet McCarrick continued to rise. He was never removed. He was never publicly disciplined. He was promoted. Parents trusted the church. Seminarians trusted the system. Many victims believed no one would challenge a man so powerful, and for years, they were right. The institutional response followed a familiar pattern: manage the risk, not the threat. Complaints were treated as reputational problems rather than crimes. Church leaders debated whether McCarrick's behavior was immoral, inappropriate, or merely imprudent, rarely confronting the reality that it was abusive. The silence expanded upward. Even as whispers reached Rome, McCarrick remained untouchable. He maintained close relationships with high-ranking officials and popes. He represented the church abroad. He mentored younger clergy. The appearance of stability mattered more than the safety of those in his orbit. It was not until 2017 that the silence finally fractured. An allegation surfaced that McCarrick had sexually abused a minor decades earlier. This time, the claim could not be quietly settled or dismissed. The Vatican announced an investigation. McCarrick was suspended from public ministry. In 2018, he resigned from the College of Cardinals, the first U.S. cardinal to do so under such circumstances. For survivors, it was both vindication and devastation. As the investigation unfolded, more victims came forward. Adult seminarians described coercion and abuse. Internal church documents revealed that leadership had known for years. The Vatican eventually confirmed that allegations against McCarrick were credible and substantiated. In 2019, Theodore McCarrick was stripped of his priesthood entirely. The fall was historic, but so was the failure that preceded it. An official Vatican report later acknowledged that warnings had been ignored, minimized, or dismissed. Decisions were influenced by incomplete information, misplaced trust, and institutional inertia. In plain terms, power had protected itself. McCarrick was later charged in civil courts, though legal outcomes were complicated by age, health, and statutes of limitation. For many survivors, justice in a courtroom was never the point. Accountability, acknowledgement, and truth were. The damage extended far beyond individual victims. McCarrick's case shattered confidence in church leadership at the highest levels. If a cardinal could operate for decades with impunity, despite warnings, what did that say about the system itself? Faith communities were forced to confront an unbearable reality. Silence had reached the Vatican. Survivors described not only abuse, but betrayal layered upon betrayal. They had trusted their mentors, trusted the church, trusted that someone, somewhere, would intervene. Instead, they were ignored, while their abuser ascended. The aftermath brought reforms, policies, and promises. Safeguards were introduced. Reporting mechanisms were revised. Transparency was pledged. But for many, these changes arrived far too late. McCarrick now lives in obscurity. His name synonymous with institutional failure. His power is gone. His influence ended. But the cost of the silence that protected him can never be undone. This case stands as one of the most devastating examples of what happens when silence is chosen, not out of ignorance, but out of calculation. When leaders fear scandal more than suffering, when authority outweighs accountability, when victims are asked to wait quietly, and it leaves behind a question that cuts to the core of faith and trust. If silence could protect a cardinal for decades, who was the church truly serving? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In Chile, Father Fernando Caradima was not just a priest, he was a gatekeeper to power, prestige, and spiritual legitimacy. For decades, he was regarded as a holy man, an elite mentor whose approval could shape careers and determine futures within the Catholic Church. Young men sought his guidance with reverence, bishops protected him with loyalty, and victims were taught, explicitly and implicitly, that speaking out would be a betrayal not just of a man but of God. The silence around Caradima was not accidental. It was cultivated. Caradima served at the El Bosque parish in Santiago, a wealthy and influential area. His parish became a breeding ground for future church leaders. Many of the men he mentored went on to become bishops and cardinals. His influence ran deep, forming a powerful internal network that discouraged dissent and punished disobedience. Behind the image of sanctity was a pattern of abuse that spanned decades. Former altar boys and seminarians later described how Caradima used spiritual authority to dominate them. He demanded obedience framed as holiness. He blurred physical boundaries under the guise of affection, prayer, and discipline. Victims reported being groped, assaulted, and psychologically controlled, often told that their suffering was spiritually meaningful, even divinely required. Those who resisted were shamed. Those who questioned were isolated. Those who spoke were ignored. As early as the 1980s, complaints were made to church officials. Families raised concerns. Victims tried to report abuse through internal channels. The response was silence or worse, retaliation. Caradima's defenders dismissed allegations as misunderstandings, exaggerations, or attacks on a holy man's reputation. Church leadership chose preservation over protection. For years, Caradima continued to operate freely, mentoring youth and influencing appointments. His victims watched as the men who had protected him rose higher in the church hierarchy. The message was unmistakable. Power listens to itself. It was not until the late 2000s that the silence began to fracture. Survivors went public, speaking to journalists after decades of internal inaction. Their testimonies were strikingly consistent, detailing abuse, manipulation, and a culture of fear that extended far beyond one parish. Public outrage forced the Vatican to intervene. In 2011, after an investigation, the Vatican found Caradima guilty of sexual abuse of minors and abuse of power. But the punishment was revealing in itself. He was not criminally prosecuted. He was ordered to retire from public ministry and live a life of prayer and penance. To survivors, it felt like another form of silence. Caradima never faced a criminal trial. He never publicly confessed. Many of the bishops he mentored initially denied wrongdoing, only acknowledging failures years later, some under intense pressure. The Chilean church entered a crisis that would eventually lead to mass resignations of bishops and a global reckoning. Pope Francis later admitted that the church had made serious errors in handling abuse cases in Chile, including Caradima's. But for victims, the acknowledgement did not erase decades of suffering or institutional neglect. Caradima died in 2021. With his death came no courtroom justice, no full accounting, no final answers. His case stands as a devastating example of how silence can be sanctified, draped in theology, obedience, and reverence until it becomes untouchable. Abuse did not continue because no one knew. It continued because those who knew chose not to act. And it leaves behind a deeply unsettling reflection. When silence is framed as faith, how many lives are sacrificed in God's name? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For decades, St. John's School for the Deaf in Milwaukee was meant to be a sanctuary. It was a place where children who already faced isolation from the world could learn, communicate, and feel safe. Parents entrusted their sons to the care of the Catholic Church, believing that faith, discipline, and compassion would guide every lesson. What those families never imagined was that behind classroom doors and confessionals, the church was choosing silence again and again while children were being systematically abused. At the center of that silence was Father Lawrence C. Murphy. Lawrence Murphy was a Catholic priest assigned to St. John's School for the Deaf beginning in the 1950s. He served as a teacher and spiritual authority, working almost exclusively with deaf boys. This gave him extraordinary power. The children relied on him not only for education, but for communication, guidance, and access to the outside world. Many were isolated from their families during the school year. Some had limited ability to report abuse at all. Murphy understood this vulnerability. Over the course of more than 2 decades, Murphy sexually abused children at the school. By some estimates, more than 200 victims. Survivors later described a pattern of repeated assaults, exploitation during confession, and manipulation of religious rituals to normalize abuse. Murphy used his position as a priest to frame sexual acts as part of spiritual instruction. He exploited the children's trust and their limited ability to communicate what was happening to them. The abuse was not subtle, and it was not unknown. As early as the 1950s and 60s, complaints surfaced. Students reported inappropriate behavior. Some tried to tell other priests or school staff. Parents raised concerns. By the 1970s, multiple allegations had reached church leadership in Milwaukee. The evidence was not a single accusation, it was a pattern. The church's response was not justice. Instead of contacting police, Murphy was quietly removed from St. John's in 1974 and reassigned to parish work. No public warning was issued. Parents were not informed. The deaf community was not alerted. Murphy was allowed to continue functioning as a priest, hearing confessions and maintaining access to children in other settings. Silence became the solution. Behind closed doors, church officials discussed the accusations. Internal correspondence later revealed that bishops were aware Murphy had abused children. There were debates not about whether the abuse occurred, but about how to handle it without scandal. The concern was not centered on victims. It was centered on reputation. Murphy was never reported to law enforcement. Years passed. Victims grew into adults carrying trauma they could barely articulate. Many struggled with depression, substance abuse, broken relationships, and lifelong shame. Some believed they were complicit. Others believed no one would ever believe them because the man who abused them wore a collar. In the 1990s, survivors finally began organizing. Former students of St. John's School for the Deaf came together and documented their experiences. They submitted a formal complaint to the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, detailing decades of abuse and naming Murphy directly. The response should have been immediate and decisive. It was neither. Church officials opened an internal investigation. They acknowledged the allegations were credible, but once again, they did not go to police. Instead, they initiated a canonical process, an internal church trial. Even then, the process stalled. Murphy was elderly and in poor health. There were concerns about publicity. There were concerns about precedent. There were concerns about everything except urgency. The case reached the Vatican. In Rome, church authorities reviewed the allegations. Correspondence later revealed that senior officials were aware of the scale of abuse. Some urged swift action. Others advocated leniency. Murphy himself wrote letters to Vatican officials, asking for mercy, claiming repentance, and emphasizing his age. The Vatican chose delay. The canonical trial dragged on for years without resolution. Murphy was never publicly named by the church during his lifetime. He was never turned over to civil authorities. In 1998, Lawrence Murphy died still a priest. He died without facing criminal charges. For survivors, his death was not closure. It was confirmation that silence had won. The full scope of the case did not become public until years later, when investigative journalists uncovered internal church documents. The revelations were devastating. They showed that church leaders in Milwaukee and Rome had known about widespread abuse of deaf children and had repeatedly chosen secrecy. The outrage was immediate and global. Victims spoke publicly about the unique cruelty of the abuse. Many explained that being deaf made reporting nearly impossible. Some did not have the language to describe what was happening. Others were punished or dismissed when they tried. The church's silence compounded their isolation, reinforcing the idea that their suffering did not matter. The archdiocese eventually issued apologies. Settlements were paid. Safeguards were promised. But the fundamental truth could not be undone. For decades, children were abused while the institution responsible for their care chose inaction. The aftermath exposed something even darker. Internal Vatican correspondence showed that officials were concerned that prosecuting Murphy might encourage other cases, particularly in the United States. There was fear of legal exposure, fear of scandal, fear of losing authority. These fears outweighed the voices of deaf children who had been violated under church supervision. Silence, in this case, was not passive. It was strategic. It was deliberate. The Lawrence Murphy case stands as one of the most horrifying examples of institutional failure in modern church history, not only because of the number of victims, but because of how vulnerable they were. Deaf children, isolated from society, entrusted entirely to a system that failed them at every level. No police intervention, no public warning, no accountability during the abuser's lifetime. Only documents, apologies, and regret after it was too late. Survivors have since emphasized that their greatest pain was not only the abuse itself, but the realization that adults knew and chose silence, that their suffering was weighed against institutional comfort and found inconvenient. This case forces an unbearable reflection. When the victims could not speak, and the church could have spoken for them, why did it choose not to? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For generations, Jean Vanier was regarded as one of the most compassionate spiritual leaders of the modern age. He was the founder of LARC, a global network of communities created to support people with intellectual disabilities. His message centered on humility, love, and dignity for the vulnerable. He was admired by popes, praised by world leaders, and revered by millions who saw him as the embodiment of moral goodness. That reverence became a shield. Jean Vanier was born into privilege in 1928, the son of a Canadian diplomat. He left a promising military career to pursue philosophy and theology. Eventually founding LARC in the 1960s, the movement spread rapidly across continents. Celebrated for its emphasis on shared life and compassion, Vanier was not ordained as a priest, but he operated in deep proximity to church authority and spiritual influence. His words carried weight. His presence inspired trust. Behind that image, a darker reality remained hidden for decades. Multiple women later came forward stating that Vanier had sexually abused them under the guise of spiritual guidance. These were not accusations of misunderstanding or boundary confusion. Survivors described a consistent pattern. Vanier framed sexual acts as part of a mystical or spiritual experience, telling women that secrecy was essential, that what was happening was sacred, and that disclosure would damage God's work. The abuse occurred over years, and it was known Vanier had been closely associated with Father Thomas Philippe, a Dominican priest who had previously been sanctioned by the Vatican for sexual misconduct cloaked in mysticism. Philippe's teachings were condemned by the Church in the 1950s. Internal Vatican records later revealed that Jean Vanier was aware of Philippe's abuses and participated in similar behavior. This information did not surface publicly. It remained buried. Church authorities knew that Philippe posed a danger. He was restricted, yet Vanier continued to associate with him privately. Complaints about Vanier's conduct emerged quietly over time, but they were not made public. His stature, reputation, and the perceived good of LARC discouraged scrutiny. Silence was chosen, not because the truth was unknown, but because the consequences of revealing it felt unthinkable. For decades, Vanier continued to lead LARC, speak globally, and receive accolades. Survivors remained silent, many believing they would not be believed. Others were deeply conflicted. How could a man who preached compassion be capable of such harm? Some feared that speaking out would destroy a movement that helped thousands of vulnerable people. The moral weight of his reputation crushed dissent. Jean Vanier died in 2019. Tributes poured in from around the world. He was celebrated as a saintly figure. Only after his death did the truth finally emerge. In 2020, LARC International released the findings of an independent investigation. The report confirmed that Jean Vanier had engaged in abusive sexual relationships with multiple women, using spiritual manipulation and secrecy. The investigation concluded that these acts were not isolated, not consensual, and not accidental. They were abusive. The revelation shocked the world. For survivors, the report was both validation and heartbreak. Some spoke publicly for the first time, describing years of silence, confusion, and shame. They explained how Vanier's spiritual authority made resistance difficult and disclosure nearly impossible. The abuse had not been violent, but it was deeply coercive. The church's role in the silence became unavoidable. While Vanier was not a priest, he operated under the moral authority of the church and alongside clergy, who were aware of dangerous theological patterns linked to Philippe. The failure to confront those patterns decisively allowed abuse to continue quietly, respectfully, and unchecked. The aftermath forced a painful reckoning. How does an institution respond when someone who embodied its values is exposed as an abuser? How does reverence distort accountability? And how many warnings are ignored because the truth threatens something perceived as good? Lark issued apologies, acknowledged failures, and committed to reform. But for survivors, the damage was already done. The silence that protected Vanier had allowed abuse to persist under the banner of holiness. This case stands apart from others, not because it was less harmful, but because it reveals how goodness itself can be weaponized. When a person is placed beyond question, silence becomes automatic, doubt becomes betrayal, and victims are left alone with their truth. Jean Vanier's legacy is now permanently fractured, marked by both genuine service and profound harm. His story serves as a warning that even the most admired figures must be accountable, and that silence, when paired with reverence, can be devastating. It leaves behind a final, unsettling reflection. When goodness is never questioned, who is left to protect the vulnerable? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.